June 4th, 1944. Somewhere outside Harlan, Iowa. The sun was just beginning to rise over the cornfields, casting long golden fingers of light across the dew-covered grass. The smell of wet earth mingled with something sweeter, the warm, sticky scent of honey radiating from the rows of beehives neatly lined beside the barn. John Winslow Carson, age 36, stood with one hand resting on the rough wooden frame of a hive box. His flannel shirt clung to his back in the morning humidity. Bees buzzed calmly around him, darting in and out of their waxy cathedrals with military precision. In that moment, he looked not like a farmer, but a quiet general presiding over 1,000-winged army. He dipped a spoon into a jar, the honey thick, amber, and glistening, then let it trail down in a slow ribbon back into the glass. His voice, raspy from years of tobacco and cold Iowa winters, broke the silence. "Sweetest thing in the world," he muttered. "But ain't nothing sweet about this war." Behind him, the distant rumble of engines grew louder. Not tractors, not trucks, airplanes. American B-17 bombers on a training flight, soaring low across the farmlands, headed for England, for Europe, for hell. John squinted up at the sky. He didn't wave. He just watched. There was no one to wave to, not anymore. His brother Mark had shipped out last winter. No letters in weeks. The war felt like another world, one that had swallowed every able-bodied man and left farmers like John behind, with bees, sweat, and silence. He reached for another jar when a low growl cut through the hum of bees, a military truck pulling up on the gravel path. Olive drab paint, United States Army markings. A soldier stepping out with a clipboard and a flat Iowa accent. "John Carson?" "That's me," he answered cautiously. "You're on the list. We're requisitioning honey for shipment to the 8th Army. Says here you've got 350 hives. That right?" John hesitated. "That's right. But you really need honey over there?" The soldier didn't smile. "Sir, we need everything, especially what lasts." As the truck backed up to his barn, John felt a strange mix of pride and helplessness. It wasn't guns or bullets he was sending, just jars of honey. He mumbled, almost to himself, "Ain't no one ever won a war with bee spit." But he was wrong. And in just 72 hours, 72 short hours, one of his stupid ideas involving that very honey would help save a convoy of American trucks rolling through occupied France. They called him a fool, a nobody, just a farmer. Until his trick with honey helped change the course of the war. The farm, the bees, and the war. John Winslow Carson was not a hero by any conventional standard. He was a farmer, a beekeeper, and like many men in rural America, he had never set foot outside his home county. Born in 1908, he inherited 160 acres of land from his father, along with an old barn, a row of tractors in various stages of disrepair, and a few dozen beehives shoved under an apple tree. By 1935, he had turned that modest setup into a full-scale beekeeping operation, managing over 200 colonies. That's roughly 12 million bees. He produced up to 3,000 pounds of honey every season, a figure that made him one of the most productive beekeepers in southwestern Iowa. But in 1941, the world changed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, on December 7th, the United States declared war, and everything, every person, every tool, every resource was suddenly pulled into the orbit of the global conflict. John watched as his neighbor's sons, and then his own brother Mark, went off to join the fight. Some enlisted. Others were drafted. John was 33 and had a bad knee from a farming accident. He was classified as 4F, unfit for service. That single letter F haunted him. He wanted to fight. Instead, he was told to grow, to produce, to harvest. While others bled on the beaches of Italy and in the jungles of the Pacific, John was asked to fill government quotas for sugar beets, corn, and soybeans. But it was his bees, not his crops, that would eventually matter most. During the early years of the war, sugar became one of the most tightly rationed items in the United States. In 1942, the federal government instituted strict limits on consumer sugar consumption, just 26 pounds per person per year, down from 100 pounds before the war. Sugar was needed for everything, from preserving food to making explosives. So civilians turned to honey. And so did the military. Honey was shelf-stable, energy-dense, and naturally antimicrobial. It didn't spoil, didn't need refrigeration, and could be packed into small containers for frontline soldiers. The United States Army began looking for suppliers who could meet this growing demand. John's name showed up in a Department of Agriculture ledger in 1943 as a registered honey producer with surplus capacity. He got a letter in the mail offering a small government contract, nothing flashy. Just deliver 700 pounds of honey to a processing facility in Des Moines, Iowa. It would be canned, labeled Army Issue, and shipped off to wherever American boys were fighting. At first, John didn't think much of it. He loaded the jars, filled out the paperwork, and went back to tending his hives. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. The U.S. military wasn't just using honey as food. Quietly, engineers and medics had begun experimenting with it in ways that hadn't been tested on a large scale before. Honey, they discovered, could also be used in field dressings for wounds, thanks to its ability to kill bacteria. It could coat metal to prevent rust. Mixed with beeswax, it could be formed into waterproof seals and even used to quiet the creak of vehicle joints during stealth operations. And still, back on the farm, John had no idea. To him, the war was still distant. Letters from Mark came less often. The ration books got thinner. The skies filled with the roar of passing aircraft. And still, the bees kept working. By the end of 1943, John had expanded his operation to 350 hives. That meant over 20 million bees under his care, producing enough honey to fill a small freight car. Yet he remained convinced that he was on the sidelines. He could not have known that his quiet work, deep in the heart of America, would soon collide head-on with one of the most audacious logistics experiments of the Second World War. All it would take was one moment, one idea, and a trick so stupid no one thought it could possibly work. Early efforts and resistance. By the spring of 1944, John Winslow Carson was producing more honey than any farmer in his county, close to 4,000 pounds. But while honey flowed from his hives, his frustration grew thicker with every shipment he sent out. The government didn't tell him where the jars went. No acknowledgement. No thanks. No proof it was helping. He'd load barrels into the back of army trucks that came with no faces, just gloved hands, clipped signatures, and the drone of an engine disappearing over the hill. "Feels like throwing it into the ocean," he told a friend. "Can't even be sure it's reaching a soldier." His neighbors didn't make it any easier. "You still playing with bee juice?" one asked him at church. "We're trying to win a war here." Another muttered under his breath, "Heard the army's going to send you a medal made of honeycomb." John pretended to laugh, but the bitterness stuck. He'd lost 2 close friends to the draft, and his brother's last letter was dated December. It was now April. Each night, he'd sit in silence, a hand on his knee, reading that last letter over and over. Mark had written, "We're cold, wet, sometimes hungry, but we move, always moving. If you send anything, send warmth." That line, "send warmth," burned itself into John's thoughts. So he started looking at honey differently. It wasn't just food. It was thick, slow-burning energy. It was waterproof, sticky, long-lasting. It could coat, preserve, bind. He remembered how his grandfather used to polish his boots with a mix of beeswax and oil. How a neighbor once used honey to plug a radiator leak in a Model A Ford. What if honey could do more? One evening, while trying to fix a sticky hinge on his barn door, he dipped a rag in a mix of old honey and linseed oil and rubbed it into the rusted joint. The squeal stopped instantly. The next morning, a truck from the Des Moines depot arrived early. Same uniform, same clipboard. But this time, the corporal in charge looked exhausted. "Last night we lost 6 trucks in Normandy," he said, not even realizing he'd let the location slip. "Lost?" John asked. "Machine noise. Smell of oil. Krauts heard 'em coming miles off. We can't sneak up with trucks reeking of diesel and groaning like coffins." Something clicked. John leaned forward. "I've got something." The corporal gave him a blank stare. I've got a compound. Made it myself. It quiets hinges. Covers odor. It's just honey, beeswax, and linseed oil." "You want us to smear bee spit on army trucks?" John didn't flinch. "Might save 6 trucks next time." The corporal laughed hard. "You're serious?" Dead serious. He expected to be mocked. Again. But instead the corporal paused, then said, "Fine, 1 crate. I'll take it to the boys at Fort Riley. See what they say." That night, John didn't sleep. Days passed, then weeks, no word. He went back to his hives, watching bees dance in tight spirals above the frames. Everything about them was silent precision. No waste, no ego, just function. He thought about how bees coat their hives with propolis to seal cracks, to muffle vibration, to hide their presence from predators. He muttered under his breath, "Those little bastards been doing stealth long before we figured it out." Then, on the 12th of May, a black military sedan pulled into his yard. 2 men stepped out. One wore a medic's armband. The other was in logistics. No uniforms, just brown coats and steel eyes. "We heard you've been mixing some things," the man in the coat said. John nodded. "We ran a field test," the other added, "on 3 trucks, coated the axles, doors, and exhaust hoods with your compound." "And?" John asked, barely breathing. "They ran silent. Smelled like a bakery, but ran quiet. Krauts didn't hear them until they were already behind the ridge." The man handed John a paper. "Effective immediately. You're authorized to produce 100 gallons of compound per month. Code name: Sweet Silence." John blinked. "Excuse me?" "Sweet Silence," the officer repeated. "Welcome to the war, Mr. Carson." In that moment, the bees outside didn't sound like bees anymore. They sounded like drums. He had just crossed an invisible line, from farmer to asset. And no one, not even John, understood yet just how far that stupid idea was about to go. The stupid idea takes root. By late May of 1944, John Winslow Carson was no longer just shipping honey. He was making war compound, one barrel at a time. His workshop, once a quiet storage shed for winter bee boxes, had transformed into a crude but relentless production line. Buckets of raw honey stood beside vats of melted beeswax and drums of linseed oil. The air inside was thick and sweet, almost nauseating. Every surface glistened with stickiness. Flies buzzed at the windows like prisoners. John didn't care. He had orders to fill. Each week, a military truck arrived from Fort Riley, Kansas, to collect the compound now labeled SSC-7, short for Sweet Silence, compound number 7. The containers bore no other markings. No one in the military told John where it went or how it was being used. But in the second week of June, he got a clue. A letter arrived, not from his brother, but from a Sergeant Benjamin Gentry, 509th Logistics Division, European Theater of Operations. Handwritten, short. Your stuff works. Coded 5 vehicles last week. Germans didn't hear us coming. Got the drop on them outside Carentan. 2 enemy trucks destroyed. 0 American casualties. Smelled like Christmas. Keep it coming. John read the note twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside a mason jar on his shelf, like a medal made of words. Still, he had questions. Would this hold up? Could honey really make a difference? Or was this just one lucky fluke, the kind of story soldiers tell before the real bullets start flying? He started experimenting, mixing new formulas, adjusting ratios. One morning, while applying a thicker batch to an old flatbed axle, he noticed something strange. The waxy layer not only reduced the squeal, but insulated the wheel from vibration. It didn't just muffle sound, it muffled detection. And in World War II, where entire columns of trucks could be located by airborne acoustic sensors, vibration mattered. So he sent a note back. To whomever this reaches, compound now acts as vibration dampener on metal surfaces. Try under vehicle hoods, side doors, exhaust seams. Also repels water. A week later, a reply came, this time typed. Tested your modifications on 8 Jeeps moving through hedgerows near St. Lo. Dampening reduced acoustic detection range by an estimated 25%. Bravo. Enclosing authorization for increase to 200 gallons per month. Prepare to ship to Port of Liverpool for pre-invasion outfitting. Liverpool. Invasion. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. John knew what was coming. Everyone did. The Allies were going to hit Fortress Europe. The question was when and where. But now he realized his compound wasn't just for patrols. It was part of something bigger, something massive. On June 3rd, a courier truck arrived with crates and a set of instructions. Prepare 10 barrels for transatlantic shipment. Label, Class A engineering materials. Destination confidential. No insignia, no rank, just urgency. That night, as John sealed the last barrel, he paused and looked out over the darkened fields. His bees were silent in their hives. No wind, no stars, just the low, thudding echo of thunder to the west. Not a storm, but something heavier. The kind of sound that stays in your bones. He didn't know it yet, but those barrels would land in Normandy within 10 days. And somewhere behind the lines, men would smear a farmer's stupid honey compound on armored doors before rolling into the most dangerous stretch of road in the war. What began as a barnyard experiment had just crossed the English Channel. Honey on the front lines. Normandy, June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day. In the chaos of the French countryside, convoys of American trucks rumbled down cratered roads under cover of darkness. The hedgerows were thick. The enemy still dug in, and German ambushes came fast and without warning. But something was different this time. According to Captain Lawrence Mendel, 3rd Armored Division, a series of modified trucks had moved silently through an area near Sainte-Mère-Église, past what scouts called a kill zone. No metallic clinks, no creaking doors, no giveaway diesel stench. We were ghosts, Mendel would later write. They expected engines and rattles. Instead, we gave them silence and molasses. That silence had a name. Sweet Silence Compound Number 7, a sticky, dark coating applied to axles, hinges, and exhaust valves. Field mechanics called it bee grease. Infantry called it ghost syrup. But whatever the nickname, it worked. Back in Iowa, John Winslow Carson had no idea what was happening. He just kept producing, kept melting, kept stirring. His hands were blistered from hot wax. His arms ached from hauling barrels. But he didn't stop. Then, on June 22nd, a military courier arrived with something unusual. A manila envelope, unmarked, containing a photograph. It was black and white, grainy, and torn along the edges. But it showed what mattered. An American convoy of 6 trucks parked safely behind hedgerows near Carentan. One soldier was crouched beside a wheel, holding a brush and a tin. Written in pencil on the back, "Your stuff. It saved us." That photo hit John harder than any letter. It meant his work, his bees, his barn. His sweat was no longer just local labor. It was now baked into the machinery of liberation. By July, the U.S. Army's Logistics Command authorized expansion of Sweet Silence to a full dozen engineering units. Over 400 gallons per week were being shipped overseas. British and Canadian forces began requesting the compound for their nighttime raids in Caen and beyond, and still the secret held. The Germans noticed fewer sounds, fewer mechanical signatures. They blamed terrain, wind, weather. They didn't know that a farmer in Iowa, a man who once couldn't get respect at the feed store, had invented a stealth technology using nothing but nature. Then came the first real test. On the night of July 29th, Allied intelligence intercepted a German plan to shell a key American resupply route near St. Lo. At least 3 divisions were depending on those trucks. If they were hit, entire frontline positions would be forced to retreat. A decision was made. Deploy a full convoy, 84 trucks, coated in Sweet Silence. The mechanics had only 6 hours to apply the compound. They worked with brushes, mops, even bare hands. The mix was thick, pungent, clinging to every joint and seam like sap from a wounded tree. At 0200 hours, the convoy moved. No headlights, no engine revs, no squeals. Just rolling shadows through the mist. German scouts didn't hear them. German mortars didn't fire. And by 0600, the entire supply run had completed without a single loss. Not one truck hit. Not one soldier wounded. The after-action report was brief. Silence preserved operational secrecy. Recommend continued use of compound SS-C7 in night convoys. For the first time in the European theater, a logistics miracle had occurred, and no one could explain it. But one man back in Iowa had an idea. Because that same morning, he received another package, this one from his brother Mark. Inside was a worn field jacket, reeking of sweat and diesel, and a note. "Your honey got here before I did." John folded the note, held it against his chest, and sat down on the step outside his barn. He could smell the wax and the oil in the air, but under it all, he could still smell the bees. And they smelled like hope. A small trick in a big battle. August 20th, 1944. The Falaise Gap, northern France. For weeks, Allied forces had been pushing German troops eastward across Normandy. But what had started as a breakout was threatening to become a disaster, not for the Allies, but for the Germans. Nearly 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were trapped between two converging Allied armies. If they could be sealed in, the German line in France would collapse. If they escaped, the war in Europe would stretch on for months. The Gap, just a 20-kilometer corridor of broken farmland and muddy roads, became a battlefield of desperation. American General Omar Bradley needed supplies to move faster than the enemy. Fuel, ammunition, rations, radios, everything. Enter Convoy Echo 9, 212 trucks, 38 jeeps, 12 half-tracks, all loaded to the brim and scheduled to cross into the Falaise region under cover of night, using unpaved farm roads, bridges barely wide enough for tractors, and paths surrounded by trees thick enough to swallow the moonlight. At 1900 hours, just before sunset, the motor pool commander made a call that would seem absurd in any other war. Apply the Carson compound, full coverage. 36 mechanics sprang into action. Barrels marked SSC7 were rolled out. The honey-based compound, sticky, heavy, and black gold in color, was brushed onto door hinges, axle joints, hood seals, and tailgate locks. The air smelled like burnt sugar and linseed smoke. Inside one of the trucks sat Sergeant Mark Carson, 1st Armored Division, John's brother. He had no idea the compound being painted onto his truck's engine came from the same hands that had pulled him out of mud holes as a kid in Iowa. He only knew what the officer said. These trucks don't squeak, don't reek. You roll silent. You get there alive. By 22:30 hours, the convoy was ready. Engines turned over with soft purrs. No revving, no clanking gear changes, just motion. The darkness was absolute, moonless, clouded, and thick with fog. Headlights were banned, radio silence enforced. Only the stars, barely visible through the haze, knew the route. As the convoy moved, it passed within 1,000 meters, just over half a mile, of a German mortar unit hidden in the hedgerows near Trun. Scouts later confirmed that the Germans never reacted. No shells were fired, no spotlights triggered. They didn't know the Americans were there. But silence wasn't invincibility. 10 miles into the route, as the trucks crossed a makeshift wooden bridge over the Dives River, a German reconnaissance patrol spotted movement. One flare went up, white, then red. Then came the gunfire. The convoy split. Half the trucks pushed forward. The rest peeled off into a ravine below the ridge, trying to outflank the attackers. Inside one of the lead vehicles, Sergeant Mark Carson manned a Browning .30 caliber machine gun. He shouted over the radio, "They see us now! Move!" But the surprise had bought precious seconds, because the first 5 minutes of silence had gotten them farther than expected, just far enough to bypass the worst of the German kill zone. German shells screamed overhead, but struck only the tail end of the formation. 3 trucks were hit, 8 men wounded, none killed. The rest? 198 vehicles made it through, over 100 tons of ammunition, 5,000 gallons of fuel, 2 entire field hospitals packed in crates. They arrived in time to reinforce the Canadian First Army, who slammed the door shut on the Falaise Gap the following morning. That night, exhausted soldiers set up triage tents and reloaded artillery in silence. Someone lit a cigarette. The medic beside him said, "Careful, this is a sugar field. You'll catch fire." They laughed. It was the first laugh in days. The name, Carson Compound, began circulating in official reports. Even General George S. Patton mentioned it in passing during a debrief. Whatever voodoo they're putting on those trucks, keep doing it. But the real moment came not from a general, but from a letter. A week later, back in Iowa, John Carson received a battered envelope with foreign stamps. Inside, a torn piece of canvas from a military tent and a scribbled note. "They used your stuff on our truck. We rolled quiet. Even under fire, I shot back and lived. Some didn't, but most of us made it. Mark." John stood in his kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the note. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just nodded. Then he walked outside to the hives, opened one carefully, and whispered, "You did good, girls." It was all he could say. The bees kept working, unaware, unbothered, just doing what they always did, sealing, protecting, building. Like John had done, like his compound had done. A sweet, sticky silence that had carried men through death and into one more dawn. The legacy of a quiet war trick. The war didn't end in Normandy. It thundered eastward, across France, into Belgium, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and finally into the shattered streets of Berlin. But for John Winslow Carson, his war, the part that belonged to him, ended on a quiet September morning in 1944, when the trucks stopped coming. No letter, no explanation, just silence. The barrels were stacked, the compound was ready, but the army never returned to collect. John didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. He knew what it meant. His job was done. By the winter of 1944, Allied forces had broken the German defensive lines. Logistics had shifted. New compounds and technologies were being developed in government labs with budgets 1,000 times what John had. There was no more need for a beekeeper's trick. But that didn't mean it hadn't mattered. In a post-war report by the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, buried between stats about truck tires and engine oil, there's a line that reads, "Temporary vehicle coating designated SSC-7 demonstrated minor but measurable improvement in stealth movement under limited field conditions. Source, civilian supplier, Iowa." No medal, no citation, just one sentence in a government document no one would read. But that was fine with John. He had never done it for glory. In the spring of 1945, as victory celebrations filled American cities with ticker tape and brass bands, John returned to what he'd always done. He repaired his tractors. He repainted the barn. He split his hives in preparation for a heavy clover bloom. And when Mark finally returned home, thinner, quieter, with a shadow behind his eyes, they said almost nothing about the war, just sat on the porch, drinking coffee, watching bees. Mark said once, after a long silence, "I heard they tested your stuff on the Navy, too." John smirked. "Well, hell, maybe I sank a U-boat." They laughed, for real this time. Years passed. The compound was never made again. The formula lived only in John's head, a mix of instinct, trial and error, and the smell of Iowa summers. In 1953, a government inspector visited John's property during a census survey of agricultural producers. At the end of a long form, The inspector asked, "Did your operation contribute to the war effort?" John paused. "In a way," he said. "I kept some folks alive." The inspector blinked. "You grew food?" "No," John answered. "I made them harder to hear." The inspector didn't write that down. By the 1960s, the barn was falling in on itself. The compound barrels rusted and empty. But the bees still worked. Their drones unchanged. Their methods still perfect. They needed no thank you, and neither did John. He passed in 1971 at the age of 63. His obituary ran 4 lines in the Harlan County Register. John W. Carson, lifelong farmer and beekeeper, died Sunday at home, survived by his brother Mark, known locally for his honey. No mention of Normandy, no mention of trucks. But on his property, beneath a rusted gate, a child decades later would find a strange metal box with a cracked jar inside. Inside the jar, a folded note, stiff with age. It read, "Sweet silence. Remember us." And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes the smallest contribution in the biggest war doesn't need to be remembered by the world, just by the men it saved. It's easy to think that history is made by generals and tanks, by grand strategies, famous speeches, and battles with names etched into monuments, but sometimes it's made by something humbler, like a man alone in a barn, like a swarm of bees, like a sticky, golden substance that was never meant for war. John Carson never stormed a beach. He never fired a shot. But his honey, his so-called stupid trick, rolled through the mud of Normandy. It crossed bridges under fire. It clung to the axles of trucks carrying wounded boys home. And it did something that almost nothing else in war ever does. It saved lives without taking any. There's something profoundly American, profoundly human in that idea. That in the middle of the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, one man, using the most ancient and natural resource on earth, could tip the balance, not with violence, but with ingenuity. A jar of honey became a weapon of silence. And for just a moment, silence was victory. So maybe it's worth asking, how many other small contributions have we forgotten? How many wars were nudged, not by bullets, but by ideas? And here's my question to you. What's the most unexpected way you've ever seen someone make a difference? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story surprised you, if it made you think differently about war, or about what it means to serve, share it. Pass it on. Because sometimes the sweetest part of history is the part we almost missed.